Project Downfall is a game that I've kinda got high hopes for. It was recommended to me a while back when it first hit early access. And it's another in a long line of indie first-person shooters that meshes together a bunch of different things into one package. We've had indie shooters like Dusk, which is a mishmash of games like Quake, Blood, and Redneck Rampage. Another one like Get to the Orange Door is what would happen if Tron was an arena shooter with Titanfall 2's movement controls. And more recently, Gunfire Reborn is kind of like Risk of Rain meets Borderlands and Chinese mythology. I do find it kinda weird though how some people get annoyed by drawing these broad comparisons when talking about these kind of video games, considering it's the easiest way on face value to just describe a game to someone. So if you are one of those people who gets annoyed by this, well, prepare to get annoyed. Because if I had to sum up Project Downfall, I'd say it is in its simplest form just Hotline Miami as an FPS. And if you were playing as a version of John Wick that was a vigilante instead of a retired hitman, suffering from extreme burnout due to abuse of prescription drugs. One of the key mechanics in the game is taking a pill that heightens your senses and activates basically bullet time mode, kinda like a futuristic blood-soaked version of Max Payne. Each mission starts with you in your apartment, skipping over just how exactly you found your way back in the first place, then you head downstairs to the street level and hop in your car to begin the next chapter. Sound familiar? And just like Hotline Miami, this thing also has an awesome soundtrack. The location where the game takes place is in a crime-riddled, giant-ass city called Crimson Tide, not too dissimilar to Mega City 1 in the Judge Dredd comics. There's a definite Blade Runner cyberpunk vibe to the whole thing too, with large neon signs decorating rain-soaked streets. Even the Terminator gets a go too. One of the subway stops is called Tech Noir, and you'll see a poster for something called the Governator in-game as well. In fact, your view also kinda looks like a T800's vision mode if it was played through a CRT screen. At one point there's a level that feels like something out of Manhunt, taking place in a fetish sex dungeon full of leather suit wearing gimps. Even topped off with a Pigsy clone, a big fat asshole coming at the player wearing a pig mask and holding a chainsaw. As for you, well, you're playing as just some kind of random dude, I suppose, living with his girlfriend and working for Omnicorp. Just making the daily commute home from work when things take a turn for the worst and you're forced to ride the dangerous Pink Line subway after you missed the last train. This also kind of reminded me of the Condemned games. In fact, your character looks a little bit like Ethan Thomas, down to the scraggly hair and the beard, and you'll even see some similar looking locations, like train stations, sewers, and alleyways. And then even kind of Silent Hill in a way, where once you go off that beaten path, the real world kind of morphs into this otherworldly, nightmarish vision of itself, where it starts to become hard to determine what's real and what isn't. What follows though is something that I could barely keep up with, and I couldn't tell you what happened if you held a pixelated gun sprite to my head. I mean, I think it has something to do with the Russian mafia, along with hallucinating a weird man in a teddy bear suit that just kept showing up to torment me. And look, that's just the path that I took. Yeah, Downfall apparently has like a dozen or so different endings depending on which choices you make throughout the story, based on factors like the levels you choose to play, and then also how you choose to interact with NPCs. I mean, for instance, early on in the game, if you've gotten to a certain point without taking any of your pills, your stay at a hotel overnight is going to be pretty uneventful. But if you've been taking those things like you're an ecstasy popping upper middle class millennial at a music festival, you'll instead throw up throughout the night and the hotel owner becomes pissed off at you. This is a minor difference, but the problem is that it doesn't always make it clear when you're at one of the more pivotal junctures. I think maybe once or twice it tells you this, but mostly it just doesn't distinguish when your actions are going to have consequences. And I'd be way more likely to put some more thought into what I was doing if I knew that these decisions were actually going to have an effect. In the Walking Dead and the Fallout games, you'd even get notifications when you were making choices that affected the overall trajectory of the story. And I almost kind of think that Downfall needs its own version of this. Outside of that almost odd amount of player choice, Downfall is really just a gruesome, satisfying, albeit basic shooter. Goal of each level, regardless of how you got there, is just to usually kill everyone as violently and stylishly as possible. You get increased points for headshots or even nut shots, because nothing's more skill-based than shooting someone in the dick. And racking up combos increases that score even more, moving you up the game's online leaderboard. In case you care about that kind of thing, you shouldn't. Combat is all about high lethality. Your character can only survive a couple of hits, and most weapons are going to kill you in only one. Like the melee weapons and some of the more powerful guns like rifles and shotguns. Again, yeah, sounds familiar. The catch though is that this also applies to enemies, and a well-placed headshot, regardless of the weapon, is going to often do an enemy right in, usually anyway. You've got a pistol which can be dual welded if you manage to catch another one in midair. Now, I don't know why that has to be done in midair, but look, that's just the way the hallucinogenic cookie crumbles. There's a couple of SMGs, one of which is so inaccurate, you're actually better off throwing it at people instead. Then there's a couple of shotguns, a rifle, and finally some more ludicrous weapons like a minigun and what I can only describe as a howitzer. You can carry up to 3 weapons at once, and you'll only get whatever ammo is in the weapon to begin with. After that, the weapon's only good for being thrown into someone's face to stun them. It all kind of plays into the way that the pills work. Knock back one of these things and you turn into a chemically enhanced force of nature. Your punches and kicks become much stronger, kicks even being able to take doors off their hinges, pulverizing whoever is on the other side of them. Just with the nasty side effect of this also affecting your end level score. Yeah, activating the most fun mechanic in the game affects your score in a negative way. Not to mention, it also has some drastic effects on the ending. I guess it's worth mentioning that one of the many side characters you talk to in this game is your own neocortex. No, not that neocortex, the one inside your brain, dingus. From the gameplay side of things, this penalty kind of makes sense. I mean, finishing levels without popping pills takes a lot more skill, but there are some instances when this is borderline impossible, at least to the best of my knowledge. I mean, I know for one of them, you need to be able to super kick a door down to proceed. So I don't think it's even possible to finish the game without using them, at least in instances like this. The alternative to this is the adrenaline mode, where you get all of the benefits of the pills, just without the nasty side effects, like the withdrawal symptoms and the disapproval of your parents. But this thing needs to be charged up beforehand by making kills, so you can't always rely on it. That simple benefit though of taking your pills or adrenaline at just the right time and then sprinting into a room guns blazing is pretty damn satisfying. Trying to do this without this mechanic though, the only effective way is to just bottleneck enemies into doorways and cap them one by one, which doesn't feel as rewarding. Still, the shooting in Downfall is, I think, pretty good at its core. There's some great gore effects with blood and guts flying out in all directions when you shoot someone, and the sound design is also kind of top-notch too, with weapons sounding crisp and impactful, along with the distorted screams of those unfortunate people you violently kill just being the icing on the cake. And yeah, you're mostly killing absolute scumbags here, the kind of people that are better off dead anyway. So I say, murder away to your heart's content. It's a simple and a basic gameplay loop. Enter room, pick up weapon, pop a couple of pills, murder everyone. Rinse and repeat. And then add in some unexplained gaps in the narrative to keep things interesting. Still, as good as this core gameplay can often be, Downfall is just a game that constantly feels like it's shooting itself in the foot. And as you'd kind of expect for something still in early access, it seems that every time you notice something you like, you'll notice something you equally dislike. But I think my main issue is how it seems that the weapon spread when shooting a lot of these guns is basically randomized, in the way that your crosshair doesn't necessarily mean that the bullet is going to go where you're aiming, often veering off to the side. Now I get why they've kind of done this, because you could easily just hang back and take pot shots at enemies when you're well out of their range, and it does make sense for weapons like the shotguns, which have a much more unpredictable pellet spread. But this still often happens a fair bit even when you're shooting enemies at medium or close range. And for a game with such a tiny margin of error, meaning a death and a level restart, this just shouldn't happen. And don't give me that bullshit about this happening because your character's on drugs or something. The whole point of the drug he's taking is that it amplifies his senses and reaction times. I mean, if anything, it should improve his accuracy. A lot like Hotline Miami, you can expect to replay some of these levels over and over. Certain levels I'd say I easily replayed upwards of 12 times. 12! Sadly, the reason for this is more often than not, however, due to things like being shot in the back by someone you couldn't possibly have even known was there, and in most cases never even saw coming. All those fancy visual effects often make it a little bit hard to see properly, and it's common for enemies to be hiding in the shadows of nearby corners, only to pop out within nanoseconds and fucking kill you. You will die over and over and over again to this, and it never becomes any less annoying. Fuck you! I mean, compare this same concept to Hotline Miami, where you at least had that top-down view though, so you could at least see where enemies were coming from. Here, however, you're limited to what is in front of you, which makes it a lot more difficult. Most of the time though, you'll probably shred through most of these levels on your first attempt, kind of like a goddamn methed up Doomslayer. But it's just that for some of them, you'll be stuck for 15 or so minutes dying over and over. It shows a massive inconsistency in the level design and how something often as simple as just the basic placement of enemies and the starting weapons or the lack thereof can have a huge effect on how a level plays out. Downfall's stamina system is also a little bit to the detriment of how the game works. Melee weapons are idiot-proof. You pick them up and you hit someone with them when they're close enough. It couldn't be simpler. There's no dodge, block, or parry system, but you can throw them at enemies with the right mouse button to stun them for a couple of seconds. After a couple of whacks with these things, they often break, which I think has just been done to balance them out more than anything else. Aside from these melee weapons though, you can also kick and punch as well, and this is where it kind of starts to fall apart. What you've got here is the old 1-2 combo. A kick will stun someone and then a punch is usually going to finish them off as long as it hits them in the head. But this attack pretty much leaves you completely defenseless afterwards because a kick drains almost your entire goddamn stamina bar. You also need to be standing toe to toe with someone for the kick and punch to even hit them in the first place. And if you miss that first kick, well, you might as well just restart the entire level because you're probably not going to be able to attack again, let alone back out of the enemy's reach in time. And this combo is really only useful against a single enemy anyway. If you've got a bunch of dudes coming after you, it's completely pointless as a means of defense, leaving your character gasping for air and totally vulnerable. I don't know man, maybe these pills are playing havoc on my dude's cardiovascular system as well. You will get an alternate pill later in the game that gives you unlimited stamina and lets you finish off enemies with a single melee hit, which is about the only time it's ever viable or even all that fun either. Oddly too, using melee weapons doesn't drain your stamina bar, but sliding does, a mechanic that has no use whatsoever as far as I can tell, outside of just letting you move around slightly faster than normal. As a result, the melee is really one of the areas I think needs the most work. Another area that might also turn off a few people is the presentation. At the beginning of the game you get an epilepsy warning, but what they don't warn you about is the abundance of visual effects that looks like someone threw up into a VHS player. Downfall hides its basic architecture and sprite work under a whole heap of visual filters, things like CRT scan lines, bloom effects, and all that other generic crap that can make your eyes bleed if you stare at it for too long. Environments are fully 3D, but NPCs, weapons, and the player's hands are all 2D sprites, making for an interesting combination that's kind of like peanut butter and jelly mixed with angel dust. Some of these environments just kind of look like the developer just converted his LSD trips into the Unity engine. Still, I think stylistically it does look pretty damn good at times, and some of the more opened up urban areas where you're moving through the city streets inhabited by shady looking characters, junkies and lowlifes, makes for some appealing and stylish eye candy. But there's two issues I have here. One of them is that the game isn't all that well optimized and frame rates can be up and down more than your mum's head in the backseat of my car.
Schwacked.
And the other one is that these visual effects can sometimes come at the expense of just basic visibility. Even something as simple as muzzle flash can be so bright to the point that you can't even see your crosshair. You can turn some of these effects down or even off entirely, but you can't change the game's art style. And if that's something that's not going to gel with you, well, I don't think any amount of game time is going to change your mind. Honestly though, I don't know if the game really deserves all that much hate, considering it's really only being worked on by a single person. It'd be like putting a one-armed man down on a piano and expecting him to suddenly play the Moonlight Sonata, or chucking him in a swimming pool and asking him to swim the breaststroke. And I really think you need to make a clear distinction between games like this and games made by big-budget AAA studios. I will say that I've been playing this thing in early access since it first came out, and it has definitely improved a lot since then, to the point that it's actually fun to play now. The general attitude I've seen from devs for early access games like these on the Steam forums, when people bring up suggestions for things to change or fix, is often a combination of standing their ground as much as it is they take the suggestions into account. Now, I'm not saying that devs need to listen to every single thing that people complain about and automatically change it, but a big part of why the Steam early access model often succeeds is because it lets the devs listen to the feedback from those people who are actually playing the game. Then they can take a lot of this stuff on board while keeping true to their original vision. And Project Downfall I think is really going to be one of those games that could really benefit from a couple of simple tweaks. And honestly, the concept of a first-person Hotline Miami-inspired shooter is one that I think has mass appeal. I just hope that Dev can work with what he's got here to make it all come together in a cohesive and enjoyable package. Right now, the whole thing lasts about 2 to 3 hours for a first time playthrough, but then factor in that you've got like a dozen different endings and it does open it up a whole lot more. Not to mention trying to replay the chapters to get the best possible scores and all that kind of shit. Still though, if nothing else, it sure does look unique, and as a game that lets you play as a burnt out, short-term memory loss suffering John Wick in a futuristic European dystopia, this is about as good as it gets.